Ladies and gentlemen, my panelists in front, good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, unlike you, Prof Ramogale, who was not given a topic, mine was even harder. I am tasked to respond to Professor Bauer, who I was listening to for the first time on this topic this morning. So I've been sitting here trying to recollect, and my age is not helping me as far as memory is concerned. But I've put together my perspective of what we're talking about, because the issue that we're discussing is an issue pertinent to all of us within the sector. You're taking it away. All right. Firstly, I want to thank you, sir, for your insightful presentation. I must say that all I saw was the brief of what had been given to you to talk on. And at that moment when I saw the brief, I did not wish to be in your shoes. And I think it was very wise of you to make a disclaimer when you started your presentation that you are not from DHET and neither are you working for NSFAS. Actually, you are one of us. I think that was, this is falling. I'm saying this because this is a very difficult subject that you are grappling with. Also, I think I must appreciate Dr. Makua for visioning and locating this relevant discussion within the discourse of teaching and learning. I think Professor Bauer, as he was moving towards the end of his presentation, ensured a link between what is happening to teaching and learning, in the sense that when the department has played its role, there is expectation that as universities, we need to produce an efficient system that does not frustrate the interventions. You know, this issue of fee-free education has admittedly resulted in a great sense of uncertainty within the sector. There is a great sense of apprehension and indeed an overwhelming sense of frustration within our universities. Why I'm saying that is because it is difficult to tell what is happening and what is going to happen next on this issue. Now, we are people of planning. We want to know what is going to happen. We work with timetables in our lecture rooms. But as far as fee-free education is concerned, you cannot predict. Universities also find themselves in an unenviable position where they are compelled, not even expected, but they are compelled to take a financial risk without any collaterals in place. On the other hand, the responsible officers continuously break promises and undertakings, while the beneficiaries of the system, their expectations are mounting ceaselessly. I'm just saying, this is my perspective, that I feel like there's disaster in the looming within the sector. Now, Professor Bauer, you hinted to the diversity of the sector at large. And you know, this diversity manifests itself in various ways. I'm looking at the challenges that the sector is facing, and I'm likening that to a wave or to waves, to the tsunami waves in particular. In 2016, we had the #FeesMustFall campaign. Now, that wave hit the sector in a serious way. Professor Bauer, you also referred to this one. But you will bear with me here, colleagues, that when that wave hit the sector, the impact was not the same across the universities. Neither were the responses that the universities gave the same. Now, the question is, what determines the response that universities give whenever a challenge erupts? Actually, I say during that time, some campuses were even torched and their academic programs seriously disrupted. But in other institutions, business continued peacefully as if they were operating in another country. The Today tsunami is the fee-free education. Similarly, in this instance, the impact and the associated disruptions are experienced differently by universities. Now, in your presentation, Dr. Bauer, you mentioned that the sector has doubled. And you mentioned a figure of 208,000 first-time entering students in 2018. Now, as I was listening to that, we know that the rolling in of this fee-free education says, as you said, this year all the first years who qualify will receive this funding. But next year, then it will be the first years and the second years moving forward. The question that I had was, it will be interesting to decipher this number according to the numbers qualifying for DHET bursary system, firstly, but more importantly, the distribution of those qualifying students across the sector. Because why am I saying that? I'm saying in the 208,000 students, if you have thumbsuck, 100,000 qualifying for the DHET funding student, and out of those 100,000 students qualifying for the DHET student, more than 50% go to specific universities, then the impact of the scheme, it's not going to be felt the same across the sector. Now, the question then that arises out of this is, what role or what roles have the prevailing occurrences plunged those affected universities into? Because it means there is a role or responsibilities that these universities should take up. And secondly, the announcement came as a shock across everyone. For how long will the muscles of those universities be able to withstand the abruptly prescribed load? Because there's a load that has been prescribed to universities. It has been prescribed abruptly, but how much strength do they have to withstand that? Well, I guess, Dr. Makua, you called upon Professor Bauer to be with us because you realize that this huge task that you are facing, or this huge challenge, requires different role players. And universities are at the forefront. So the voice that should engage with this task is the voice of the universities. And indeed, you mentioned the mandate of USEF, Professor, by saying that USEF facilitates effective dialogue among universities, government, business, parliament. You know? It also speaks on behalf of universities on major issues with implications for the well-being of universities. And I think this is one of the areas that we need to be engaging on. You can't blame us for expecting you to do the almost impossible, to provide answers desperately yearned for under these circumstances. It is a natural response. Right. You know, when this announcement was made in December last year, it invoked a spectrum of reactions within the sector, within the country at large. Well, at that time, the greatest criticism leveled against this was that the previous president had instituted a HERA commission to look at the feasibility of introducing fee-free education in South Africa. Now, the commission came up with the recommendations to the presidency, right? But, I mean, there are many of them. One of them was that the government must increase its funding to the department to 1% of the GDP of the country. The other one was that the government must look at student housing, which is the greatest challenge. But on the overall, actually, the important one is what you referred to, Professor Bauer, a different model of funding. A colleague here asked of what model will USEF be advocating, because the thinking was that the fiscal position of South Africa is not yet ready to roll out free higher education at large. But this announcement of the 16th of December was in direct contrast to that. And that was the greatest criticism. And I guess also the fact that the system was not ready itself. Because if you're going to roll out such a project, a massive project like that, you need to have systems in place. That also was a challenge. So the announcement did not take into consideration the income contingency loan approach that the Commission had actually recommended. Now, you also indicated the challenges of this bursary model. Now, I say here, I like the idea of you demystifying the myth that there is free education. Because people think when we say free education, it means people just walk through the gates of universities and receive free education. But what actually is happening is that there is a bursary scheme in place set up by DHET. And students are, those qualifying students then are beneficiaries of the bursary. There are other myths that come with this announcement, Professor Power. The myth that we are feeling as MUT is that the perception is whatever comes from the department is mainly for student allowances and student food. And the recipients of the bursary are not cognizant of the fact that this bursary, the allocation thereof has to go to housing or their accommodation costs, traveling costs, even their tuition costs. So when an announcement comes or when a voice goes out that NSFAS has given 14 million to MUT, students go on rampage and they want that money to be put into their pockets. Whereas there are many other expenditures that go with this bursary. I'm mentioning monies because I think it's important that in this context, Prof, as we reflect on your talk, we also reflect on the MUT story. Since the beginning of 2018, by the end of March this year, MUT had spent 61,107,085 rands on all students qualifying for this DHET bursary scheme. This expenditure is in lieu of accommodation, buses, and student allowances. Now, I'm pausing there and I'm going back to your talk. You said that Treasury announced a figure that they will have built into the budget over the next years. And I think the emphasis that you might have missed is that you say that does not mean the money is there. It just means that figure has been committed into the budget. We are all as universities holding to the hope that something will come out of that commitment, you know? You also made an observation that from what is happening, it looks like NSFAS seems not to be having sufficient capacity to roll out this scheme. And now the question that I ask myself is, when we talk about lack of capacity for NSFAS, is it that their systems had not been developed to meet the demands of this venture? Or is capacity in the sense that there's actually no money to cater for this venture? Because I think where we are now, we are at the stage where we are at the stage where we should be getting cash as universities. So it is no longer about the commitment into the budget, but it is about cash flow going down to the universities. We were visited by the Deputy Minister for Higher Education and Training earlier in the year, Mr. Manana, and in the CEO of NSFAS, Mr. Zwane. You know, in our interaction with them, and they actually even went to the venue where students were registering, we got assurance that we're going to be assisted and all the challenges were going to be resolved. I think our Vice Chancellor, Professor Ramkhali, can bear me out again here that to date, we've only received 2 tranches from NSFAS, which amount to 29 million rands. It will be 28, just above 28 million rands. And remember what I said, we've spent about 61 plus million rands on students or NSFAS qualifying students. And, you know, this is even at the backdrop of our Vice-Chancellor and his delegation physically visiting the office of the NSFAS to plead with them to bring the relief to the university. Promises were made, but promises were never kept. Professor Bauer, you mentioned that as universities, when the department comes with this intervention, in particular of a possible elimination of student debt, then we will need to come to a party as well. Because if you look at the conditions of the grant, we don't want students to remain within the system for a longer period of time. The concern that I'm having, Prof, is that the challenges that the rolling in of the system is posing seem to be too big for the system in some instances. That whenever a new approach is embarked on, there is what we call the teething problems. We're just hopeful that the teething problems for this rolling out do not boil up to something major, so that after this phasing in period, we don't remain with universities in some instances. You're challenging universities to play their roles within the societies. But the management of universities, I've been in the academia for quite some time. I've just moved to management. And what I'm tasting there is not pleasant at all, colleagues. Management of universities, we are grappling with monsters that are undefined. You know, I'm a mathematician. We define regular shapes. And when a shape has no definition, when you can't describe it, it is an irregular shape. Then that requires high-level computing skills to determine its features, its area, its volume, etc. You know, you need that. But this is exactly what management of a university in South Africa is currently today. The problems that we are facing are irregular in nature. What is more of a challenge is they change form from second to second. So I think then the question that I'm asking back is, how do we engage with dramatic issues facing our societies? How do we provide leadership to university communities when decisions taken outside our involvement, you did concede to the shock when the announcement was made? How do we provide leadership when such decisions bring our universities to disaster? I think, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to give the floor to the members of the panel, but also to the floor at large to try and exchange ideas on this important topic. Thank you very much. I'm now going to facilitate a question and answer session. Members of the floor will ask questions and members of the panel will give answers. But maybe before I do that, I'm going to allow members of the panel to give a 1 to 2 minute reflection on the topic that we are discussing. Right. We'll just go in that order. Maybe the man whose shoes are burning the most, Professor Ramkhale.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ndlanzi. For me, the issue that I would like to lift out from Professor Bauer's presentation is the issue about what he calls the legitimacy crisis of our universities. Why is it that when our universities were under attack, were besieged, no one came to their defense? it's something that we seriously need to think about, because even now as we speak, several universities have had to shut down because of student protests. They want allowances. If you don't have deep pockets as a university, you will run out of cash bankrolling NSFAS. And then when you run out of cash and you can't pay allowances, then students go on the rampage. And so several universities have had to close. Those universities that are open are those universities that have reserves to bankroll NSFAS until money comes in. Now, in all of this, indeed, it is a concerning fact that in all of this, we've not had anyone come to the defense of the universities. It's like it is our problem. And yet it is a problem that emanates from elsewhere. We are expected to find solutions. Even students expect universities to find the money. They are not interested in the fact that NSFAS has not made the funding available. Universities are the nearest target, and so they go for you to give them the allowances. Now, it is a matter that we really need to reflect on. Why is it that our universities are treated like God's stepchildren? Because these are national assets. And if we abandon them the way it is happening, they will die. And we cannot afford to have a national university system that collapses because of social indifference. That's something that I would like us maybe to reflect upon as to why is it that universities have been left on their own. You've not had even, government trying to come to the defense of universities to say, students, back off, This has nothing to do with the universities. Wait for Treasury to make funding available. The problem is it's your own internal problem. You sort it out. And yet they know it's not our problem. We are actually bankrolling NSFAS as we speak. We are bankrolling NSFAS. And if you don't have money, you run out of funds and then students go on strike. So that's, for me, that was an interesting observation, which I think we need to talk about.
Thank you. Okay.
Hello, everybody. My name is Bill Cope, and I'm from, I work at the University of Illinois in the US, but I'm actually from Australia originally. And I thought I'd just very briefly tell you a couple of snapshots from my life. So I went to university in Australia when there were no fees. All university education was free. But it was also a time when the top tax rate, if you were rich, was 90%. It was also a time when the government owned the main airlines, the government owned the railways, the government owned the main bank. So we were in a time when government and the public sphere was valued. Unfortunately, now we're in a time when the public sphere hasn't been valued. It's been devalued, and public universities have been part of that. Now, I now work in a university in the United States where students are crippled by fees. So, to give you an example, I'm working with medical students and veterinary medicine students. They've done a first degree and they've paid big fees, and when they come to do their second degree, the degree costs them $200,000, and they start their lives with a lot of debt. So this is a dilemma that we face, and I'm in a public university, a state university, where only 15% of our money comes from the government. The rest of it is raising money from students, which is cruel and it's punishing. So I've had those two experiences, living in a world where the public sector was valued and where education was free, and now I live in a world which is not. which is very, very hard for students, even in an affluent country like the United States. It's very, very hard. Now, you know, the problem for me then is, and I think it's exactly the point that our two speakers have been talking about, is how do we change our models. Universities are very expensive places, they're expensive forms of provision. And to give you an example, I've been experimenting with using MOOCs. So I offer my courses, which you pay quite a lot of money for at the University of Illinois, through Coursera, and you can do the same course through Coursera for $49. And I got an email last week from a teacher in regional Nigeria saying, I did your course and it changed my life and it was really helpful to me. But my university for that course gets half the money, $49, half goes to Coursera, so my university gets $24.50 for my offering that course to that student. Now that's only possible because of the internet, because of new technologies, but also new assessment methodologies. So part of my objective is, how do we change our business models? How do we make what we do more affordable? I would like to go back to the world that I grew up in, but it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen tomorrow. I would like to advocate that it does happen, but maybe it's not going to happen. So what do I do pragmatically as an educator? How do we do what we do really well and really effectively and cheaply? And technology is part of a solution to that, including assessment technologies around big data and learning analytics and artificial intelligence, which is some of the areas that I've been working in. So later on, after lunch, I'm going to show you some examples of some of the work that I've been doing. But we do, I think our speakers agree, we face a crisis of credibility, and we're in a difficult situation at the moment in universities. And we have to really, really rethink what we do and change what we do, perhaps in ways that we're not comfortable with always.
So much. First of all, Professor Ndlanzi, I'd like to thank you for your comments, because I think they help to sharpen the, just the input and so on. I want to make 2 points just to pick up on what, what the two previous inputs indicate. I mean, the first one is just Professor Ndlanzi raises the question about leadership, and I think that is one of the major challenges we face. I mean, just when we are under such periods of crisis, how do you kind of provide leadership? How do you kind of look beyond the